one supreme intelligence designs, emanates, sustains, transforms, annihilates, and recreates all that is. And so all that is consists of the energy of that intelligence, of its power, its perfect goodness, its beauty, its love, its bliss. This one supreme intelligence is all, and therefore it is all that is real. This supreme intelligence has imagined archetypal forms of beauty, of carriers of this intelligence into a world of infinite possibility, of the application of creative intelligence in a context of multiplicity. But that multiplicity is a union, because all beings are linked by and within the matrix of this supreme intelligence. But because the archetypal beings, who then manifest their own forms, are given free will by this supreme intelligence, they are able to design their own worlds within worlds. They are able to make the world into their own dream. And they do this by constructing a private language separate from the mind of the supreme intelligence of the God Self. And thus the ego that is different from the all is different because it is composed of language, a non-divine language, a language that is composed only of sounds that have no meaning. They are simply differences, differences of inflections of the capacity of sound making by the organism. And each slight difference of sound then is given an arbitrary meaning by that now separate node of intelligence that has, through the creation and possession of and by language, become different from the sameness of the all. And so the ego exists as difference from itself. Its existence being an illusion, because there is nothing real that is separate from the all, maintains its illusion of separation through being different from itself. That means alienated from itself. That means ignorant of itself. And so the ego, in its desire to sustain its own separate existence, must be dedicated to its own ignorance of what is real. Because as soon as it is in resonance with what is real, there is no more ego. Because the separation was only an illusion sustained by filling the silence of the luminous presence of pure awareness with language, signifiers that are simply pure differences from the silence, and that construct illusory systems of fantasy that are based on the desire for forms, for the possession and the control of forms that have emerged out of the infinite potentiality of the light of being. But forms are temporary. They are in a flux. They do not remain, and they degrade. And the more that they are desired, the more that there is an emotional charge upon them, the more that they morph into the various permutations of the fantasy of the ego that runs from very positive to very negative. And thus the ego's emotional stability is always at risk, because having created a private mind separate from God, it is now out of touch with itself. And because it lacks real being, in order to have some sense of stability and reality, it must become codependent upon the desire of another. The very life of the ego depends on the illusion of another's love. But the love of the other that is chosen is another illusory other. And so the collusion of fantasies that are based in the private languages of egos that think they are connecting with each other are creating a folie à deux, an illusion of connection. But there is no connection. There is no rapport or relation between egos, because all they can ever be is different from the self, and therefore different from each other. And in that difference, there cannot be a sustained harmony, or a sustained communion, or a sustained sense of understanding. But a glitch will always appear in the matrix, because the ego itself is a glitch in the matrix. It sustains its illusion of existence through a perturbation of its own energy field that creates a form of suffering, which it can obsess about, and thus give itself a false center of concern that enables it, through its own disturbance, to believe in its reality. And thus the ego is threatened by peace. It's threatened by real love, which is union, because it will destroy its difference. It's threatened by knowledge. It's threatened by coherence. And so the ego is the literal mortal enemy of itself, and therefore of every other. But at some point, the ego's resources become exhausted. Its capacity to create temporary bonds of seeming support systems become unable to sustain a flow of love, because each ego is in such a state of exhaustion that its last reserves of love are quickly used up. Its last reserves of life energy. become completely depleted by the very act of attempting to recharge themselves through the dependence upon the presence and the seeming support of one's own fantasies by another. But that validation of the fantasy structure, which produces a sense of temporary satisfaction and wholeness, will soon collapse into the fear of abandonment, into the sense of not being understood, into the fear of the loss, of the fall into its own chaotic incoherence, into its own hell realm from which it cannot be reached by any other, because it has become too different to sustain its last thread of connection to the all. And the final bubble of the ego will and must pop so that whatever life energy remained in it can return to the one. It is this movement of return that brings about the end and a new beginning, the end of all the dreams that had become nightmares, the end of all the ambitions, the foolishness, the follies of the egos in their delusions of power, and the end of the great project of difference, of specialness, of a oneness that is not the one, but another who usurps the throne of the one. And it is that final archetype of conflict, noted in religions as that between God and Satan, or Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, or in whatever other forms of Gnostic dualism that have been invented in order to metaphorize this battle between the deprived private mind of an ego and the public unified field of infinite consciousness, must always end with that return to the one that is real. And difference must dissolve back into sameness, into the radiance, into the light that the ego rejected in favor of the darkness of its own machinations, its own attempts to gain a special niche in the public dream of a reality that it could not control, it could not take over, and it could not find satisfaction within because of its very demand to be recognized as superior. And so this very common in its own difference, its ignorance of its own sameness, because if all there is difference within the ego, then every ego is in fact the same, cut from the same mold. Its very sense of difference is illusory, because there is nothing but the same, the all, the one, the single intelligence. And at some point, there is a recognition that one must cut one's losses, which require the cutting of all attachments of the ego to those signifiers that support its illusory existence, whether those be other people, body parts, pets, objects of interest, professions, talents, attributes, or whatever it is that has been invested in as the signifier of specialness, must be sacrificed in order to return to that ocean of purity that had been defiled by those treasures of the ego that keep it as one who is different, who must at last resort to a difference that is demonic in nature, toxic, poisonous, a difference that destroys its own happiness, so that its narrative becomes melodramatic, horrific, enters into genres of fiction that become ever more perverted and self-tormenting, because the ego can only sabotage itself and must do so in order to prolong its illusion of existence as a hell realm of suffering. The good news is that because it is all fictional, because it is unreal, because the self has never been lost, even though it had been ignored by conscious attention, that at some point when the symptoms of suffering overflow into the body and into one's karmic situations sufficiently to prevent the ongoing belief in one's project, there must be a surrender. And that surrender brings one, even though fighting and struggling against it, back to one's own salvation, back to that beautiful ocean of light, of love, that is found when the language of the ego is finally silenced and the stillness of God's presence is felt throughout the field of awareness that one is. And that return to the recognition of God enables the power, the intelligence, the love, the beauty, the joy of God to redream the world through the instrument of one's own form. And that form, in the act of sacrificing its own temporary inflection of its archetypal nature, dissolves back into the real, to be reborn as the perfect avatar of the One Self. And so all that remains at this final moment of a cycle of time that is coming to its merciful end is the rite of passage into the death of ego and the eternal life to be rediscovered of the One Self that is all you have ever been or ever shall be.